Right now, as you are watching this, the National Weather Service, NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, and every regional forecast office from Bismarck to Amarillo to Little Rock are telling the country the same thing. And the reason so few people are hearing it clearly is that what is about to arrive does not look like a storm on any weather app, does not spin on any satellite loop, and does not produce a single dramatic image the way a hurricane or tornado does. It is quieter than that, bigger than that, and measured against the historical record of what has actually killed the largest number of Americans in any single weather category over the past 30 years, it is more dangerous than the storms that get all the headlines. On August 19, 2026, NOAA issued a coordinated excessive heat watch and heat advisory package covering portions of 18 states, from the northern Rockies through the Great Plains, across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, and reaching into the southeast and the mid-Atlantic. The trigger is not one storm system. It is the specific atmospheric configuration, a persistent upper-level ridge, meteorologists call it a blocking high, that has begun to strengthen and expand over the central United States and is projected by the ECMWF, GFS, and Canadian ensemble models to lock in place for the next 2 to 3 weeks. Under that ridge, air sinks. As it sinks, it compresses and warms. Cloud formation is suppressed. Rain systems are steered around the ridge's flanks. Days become progressively hotter, nights fail to cool, soil moisture evaporates and vanishes, and the atmospheric conditions that normally moderate late summer heat by triggering afternoon thunderstorms simply do not form. This is what meteorologists call a heat dome. It is not a storm. It is the deliberate absence of storms, an atmospheric configuration whose defining characteristic is that nothing moves through it and everything beneath it gets baked. And the specific pattern setting up over the central United States this week has the signature of one of the strongest and most persistent heat dome configurations in the modern observational record. Today, we break down what a heat dome actually is at the physical level and why the country's most consequential weather hazard is the one that produces no dramatic imagery, why shock the entire country is not an exaggeration for what a locked blocking pattern of this scale can do in 3 weeks, the two most instructive American heat disasters in the past 3 decades, one where a city was catastrophically unprepared and lost 739 people in 5 days, one where a region had genuine modern preparation and still lost hundreds, because the scale of the event exceeded what any preparation had ever anticipated, and what a nation whose infrastructure was designed for a milder climate has to reckon with when the atmosphere delivers exactly the pattern it is delivering this week. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the meteorology, the record, and the real stakes. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from, and what are your daytime highs projected to be this week? Because the interior United States is about to run a temperature record test that will hit tens of millions of people simultaneously, and the specific communities that get hit hardest are almost always the ones that were told least clearly what was coming. Tell me your city, your projected temperature this week, and honestly whether your home has functioning air conditioning that you can afford to run on the highest bills of your year, because the answers to those questions in the aggregate are exactly the map of who lives and who dies in the pattern this video is describing. Subscribe right now if you want live coverage of the heat dome as it unfolds, updates as records fall, and the honest health and safety information that heat waves so rarely get compared to storms. Completely free. A thumbs up helps this reach people in the affected states before the peak of the pattern arrives instead of after. Let us go for 6,000 likes. Now let us start with why a heat dome is the specific weather phenomenon this country most consistently underestimates. Extreme heat is the deadliest weather category in the United States by a wide margin, and it has been for as long as records have been kept. NOAA's own 30-year statistics on weather-related deaths consistently show heat killing more Americans annually than tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, and cold combined in most years by a factor of 2 or 3. The reason this fact is not more widely known is structural. Heat kills without cameras. Its victims are usually elderly, socially isolated, medically vulnerable, or economically constrained, populations whose deaths appear in medical examiner reports weeks later, attributed to cardiovascular events or heat stroke, rather than in the immediate live coverage that hurricanes and tornadoes command. The bodies are found in apartments. The news arrives in mortality statistics, not in real-time satellite imagery. And by the time the death toll is fully counted, the media cycle has moved on to the next storm. The physics of a heat dome makes this deadliness inevitable when the pattern is strong enough. Under a strong blocking high, 3 specific effects compound each other. First, the sinking air is dry, which prevents cloud formation and increases direct solar heating at the surface. Second, the same subsidence suppresses afternoon convection, the thunderstorm activity that normally provides temporary cooling and boundary layer mixing in late summer. Third, as the pattern persists, soil moisture is depleted and the surface can no longer cool itself through evaporation. Once soil moisture is gone, essentially all of the incoming solar radiation goes into sensible heat rather than latent heat, and the diurnal cycle collapses toward extreme daytime highs and stubbornly warm overnight lows. It is those warm overnight lows, the failure of the atmosphere to cool below the mid-20s Celsius at night, that most directly correlate with heat-related mortality. A single hot day is a discomfort. A week of hot days followed by nights that never cool is a public health emergency. The pattern setting up over the central United States this week is projected to produce exactly that configuration. Daytime highs across the northern plains, central plains, and southern plains are projected to reach 40 to 46 degrees Celsius, 105 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit, across large portions of the affected zone by the end of the pattern's first week. Overnight lows in urban areas across Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, and northern Texas are projected to fail to drop below 28 degrees Celsius, 82 degrees Fahrenheit, for multiple consecutive nights. Humidity, normally moderate across the plains at this time of year, is being kept elevated by moisture flow from the Gulf that is being steered along the ridge's southern flank, producing heat index values that will exceed 55 degrees Celsius, 130 degrees Fahrenheit in Oklahoma and Texas by the pattern's peak. Those numbers are not projections of the record daily temperatures at a single station. They are the projected typical conditions across a corridor that will affect tens of millions of people simultaneously, sustained for 2 to 3 weeks. That is what a strong heat dome is, not the extreme value at one location on one day, but the sustained oppression of an entire region's atmospheric system, refusing to release for weeks at a stretch. Now, the reason the title says shock the entire country and not just the affected region, because the downstream effects of a central U.S. heat dome reach far beyond the heat itself. The agricultural corridor of the central United States is the world's most important single food-producing region for corn and soybeans, and both crops are in the specific phenological window right now where extreme heat and moisture stress translate directly into yield losses that cannot be recovered. Late-season corn silking and soybean pod fill are the most heat and moisture-sensitive stages of the crop cycle. A 3-week heat dome arriving in the last 2 weeks of August will remove a measurable percentage from the 2026 harvest of both crops. Commodity markets began pricing this in on August 19th within hours of the extended outlook. Global food prices from a strong central U.S. heat dome propagate outward for months. The southern plains and midwestern power grids will be tested at the specific edge of their designed operating envelope. Peak electrical demand across the affected states during a heat dome of this magnitude will exceed anything the grid operators have seen in a decade. Load shedding saw controlled rolling blackouts to prevent uncontrolled grid failures becomes a real possibility, and the last time significant heat-driven blackouts occurred across the affected corridor was during the summer of 2011, an event that killed dozens of vulnerable residents whose air conditioning failed in the exact conditions that made air conditioning most critical. Wildfire behavior across the drought-stressed West is amplified by the ridge's suppression of storm activity that would otherwise deliver rainfall to western fire zones. Already active fires that we covered in previous videos are being driven by the same atmospheric configuration into more aggressive behavior. Ozone air quality across urban areas under the ridge deteriorates dramatically as heat and stagnant air combine to produce photochemical smog at concentrations dangerous to sensitive populations. And the human health toll, the direct one, begins on approximately day 3 of a heat dome and compounds through every day thereafter. Emergency room visits for heat-related illness begin rising immediately. Cardiovascular events driven by heat stress begin to appear in mortality data by the end of the first week. Excess mortality, the difference between actual deaths during the event and the deaths that would statistically be expected, becomes measurable across the affected zone. Historical analysis of past U.S. heat dome events consistently shows excess mortality in the low thousands for regional scale events, and in the higher thousands to tens of thousands for events on the scale that is currently projected. That is the meaning of shock the entire country. Not that everyone will experience 46 degrees, that the pattern affects agricultural markets, electrical infrastructure, wildfire behavior, air quality, and human health across a geography so large that the aggregated impact reaches into every state through prices, grid stability, smoke transport, and news coverage of preventable deaths. Now let us look at what 2 American heat dome events in the past 3 decades actually delivered, because the contrast between them shows both what unprepared populations lose and what even prepared regions cannot fully protect against. Between July 12th and July 16th, 1995, a persistent heat dome settled over the central United States with Chicago at its heart. Daytime highs in the city reached 41 degrees Celsius, 106 Fahrenheit. Overnight lows failed to drop below 27 degrees for 4 consecutive nights, and the city was catastrophically unprepared. Chicago in July 1995 had no heat emergency plan of the kind that has since become standard. Cooling centers were not proactively opened. Public messaging about heat as a lethal hazard was minimal, and the city's most vulnerable populations, elderly residents in walk-up apartments without air conditioning, socially isolated seniors who did not open their windows for fear of crime, low-income neighborhoods with the least tree cover and the most heat-absorbing urban surfaces, died in numbers that overwhelmed the county medical examiner's morgue capacity. Refrigerated trucks had to be brought in to store the bodies. The official excess mortality attributed to that 5-day event was 739 people in Chicago alone. Post-event reviews documented every failure: the isolation, the poverty, the lack of city response, the racial and socioeconomic geography of who died, and Chicago rebuilt its heat response infrastructure from scratch. Chicago has not lost that many people to a heat event since. But the 1995 disaster is the American baseline for what a heat dome does to an unprepared city. Now look at the Pacific Northwest in late June of 2021. Between June 25th and June 30th, 2021, a heat dome of a strength that had almost no analog in the region's historical record settled over the Pacific Northwest. Portland, Oregon reached 46.7 degrees Celsius, 116 Fahrenheit, 5 degrees higher than the city's previous all-time record. Seattle reached 42.2 degrees, 108 Fahrenheit, in a city where fewer than half of homes had functioning air conditioning because the historical climate had never justified it. And in the village of Lytton, British Columbia, the temperature reached 49.6 degrees Celsius, 121 Fahrenheit E, the highest ever recorded in Canada. And the following day, the entire village burned to the ground in a wildfire ignited under the same atmospheric conditions. The Pacific Northwest in 2021 was not the unprepared Chicago of 1995. Heat action plans existed. Cooling centers were opened. Public messaging about the danger was aggressive and multilingual. Emergency response systems were activated across Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. And yet the estimated excess mortality across the region from that 5-day event reached over 600 people. Oregon alone recorded over 100 heat-related deaths, Washington over 150, British Columbia over 600 excess deaths attributed to the event. The event killed more people in the Pacific Northwest than any prior single weather disaster in the region's history. Post-event analyses reached the honest and difficult conclusion: the scale of the atmospheric event so far exceeded any regional historical precedent that even a genuinely prepared population and a functioning public health response could not prevent mass casualties on the scale that occurred. Chicago 1995 and Pacific Northwest 2021 are the two poles of what heat dome preparation means. Chicago shows what happens when a city is not ready and the pattern is strong. Pacific Northwest shows what happens when a region is ready and the pattern is stronger than what preparation was ever built to handle. Both events killed at scale. Both events are the reference class for what the current pattern over the central United States could produce if it verifies as the models are projecting. Let us be direct about the practical message, because information without action is just anxiety, and no weather category in America is as personally actionable as extreme heat. If you live in the affected corridor, the Great Plains, the Central Mississippi Valley, the Southeast, the Mid-Atlantic, begin cooling preparation now before the pattern peaks. Confirm that your air conditioning system is functional. If you have a window unit, verify it runs at maximum capacity. If you do not have air conditioning, identify your nearest cooling center now. Most cities publish these publicly through emergency management websites and confirm its hours of operation. Do not wait until day 4 of the pattern to make this plan. Check on your elderly neighbors every day, in person if possible. Excess heat mortality is concentrated overwhelmingly in the elderly, the medically vulnerable, and the socially isolated. A single check-in call each day during the peak of the pattern can and does save lives. If you know someone who lives alone, is over 65, has cardiovascular or respiratory conditions, or is medicated in ways that impair thermoregulation, antipsychotics, some blood pressure medications, diuretics, this is the time to check on them daily. Not to hope they are fine, to confirm it. Hydrate proactively, not when thirsty. The thirst mechanism in the elderly is measurably impaired and does not reliably signal dehydration until well after it has begun. Set alarms if necessary. Water throughout the day. Do not exercise outdoors during peak heat hours. Reschedule to early morning or late evening, or move indoors entirely for the duration of the pattern. The specific interaction of high heat with high humidity produces conditions where the human body's thermoregulatory system cannot dissipate metabolic heat generated by exertion, and cardiovascular events under those conditions are neither predictable nor survivable in many cases. For local governments and public health agencies in the affected corridor, this is the window in which pre-positioning of cooling centers, verification of home visit protocols for isolated elderly populations, coordination with utilities to avoid disconnections during the event, and public messaging in multiple languages must all be executed. The specific week between the outlook and the peak of the pattern is exactly the window in which lives are saved. Chicago 1995 was preventable. Some fraction of Pacific Northwest 2021 was preventable. What is preventable in the current pattern depends entirely on what is done in the coming days. Final thought. The word storm carries the association of drama, of wind and rain and dark skies and cameras following it in real time. The pattern setting up over the central United States this week has none of those associations. It looks like a hot day, then another hot day, then a week of hot days, then more. It does not spin on satellite imagery. It does not have a name. It does not produce dramatic footage that goes viral. And this quiet, undramatic, invisible nature is precisely why heat kills more Americans than any other weather category in an average year, and why a strong heat dome of the kind projected this week can shock a country accustomed to associating disaster with visible violence rather than the slow oppression of an atmosphere that refuses to move. Chicago in 1995 lost 739 people in 5 days to a heat pattern the city was not culturally or institutionally prepared to recognize as an emergency. The Pacific Northwest in 2021 lost over 600 in 5 days despite being far more prepared because the event exceeded every historical baseline. Both events reshaped their region's heat response infrastructure. Neither event stopped heat from being the deadliest weather category the following year, or the year after, or the year after that. The pattern this week is real. The lead time is real. The 3 weeks between now and when the pattern is projected to release are the specific window in which cooling centers are opened, vulnerable populations are visited, air conditioning systems are serviced, and public messaging reaches the people it needs to reach. The pattern will produce records. Some of those records will be temperatures. Others will be deaths. Which category is larger depends on what happens in the days ahead, not because the atmosphere can be stopped, but because it can be prepared for by people who take a heat outlook as seriously as they take a hurricane advisory. We will track every outlook update, every record broken, and every major impact from this pattern as it unfolds. Subscribe so you do not miss it, and leave that comment. Your city, your projected temperatures this week, and whether you have a real cooling plan for the pattern that is coming, because the map of who prepares and who does not is the map of who survives. 6,000 likes. Let us go.